In a context where social justice and better legislation for the improvement of the quality of life among human beings is in concern, socio-political movements in status quo experience a system where there is a shepherd that guides them, and eventually the entire movement depends on a single figurehead. The advocacies can be very reliant to one figurehead, that it limits the capability of these movements to move and take action because they have to wait for what the figurehead will either decide to do or will actually do. We think that more often than not, it also creates a disjunct because not all members of a movement can directly identify with the figurehead. That is why cohesion, in most cases, is just a front and is not necessarily genuine or a reality. That's the reason why we think, coming from opening government, that we believe it is better to have movements, socio-political, that continue to fight for whatever they believe without necessarily pinning everything down only to one person, because we don't want them to stagnate and we don't want them to depend on whatever a particular figurehead would essentially say, Mr. Speaker and members of this most of the assembly. What will be the standards that I will use in essentially telling you why we prefer movements without one figurehead? One, we think that it's better for social order. Second, it's also better for mobility. And lastly, it's also better, especially in achieving a cohesive social and socio-political movement at the end of the day. Now to my first idea, why is it necessarily beneficial for social order? Because if you look at it, I already established that the reason why in most cases, the front of being a united social movement is something that is not a reality, because the collection of all important concerns are not necessarily accommodated either equally and equitably. And the reason why this is harmful, it's because it creates a disjunct between people who were already recognized by the figurehead, whose concerns were already recognized by that figurehead as something that's valuable, as opposed to individuals who have equally valid concerns but are not necessarily taken forward in as far as the social movement is actually concerned. We think that the lack of recognition for equally important concerns is something that we think will create problems towards the movement by creating divisions that would essentially allow individuals not to appreciate anymore the kind of goals that they wanted to establish. That's the reason why, when we prefer movements that do not necessarily have a singular figurehead, we are actually looking into social movements with equal ownership to the struggle. Because now, compromises and concessions are not going to be difficult to achieve, given that there's no one in the upper position to declare which is important and which is not. Fine, there will be cases where organically there might be problems and disagreements. But the fact still remains that it's because it's a shared goal, Mr. Speaker, it's a shared ownership of the movement, that it's less likely for people to antagonize each other, given that they also have to mobilize themselves in the long run, Mr. Speaker. Something that we think is important, given that right now, there are so many struggles and there are so many plights that these social movements need to address. But before second one, yes?
Who determines what concerns are equally valid and equally important?
Well, in as far as that question is concerned, it relies on the members of the socio-political movements. Because in as far as their concerns are concerned, the reason why they entered these movements in the first place, the reason why they identified themselves within these movements, it's because they think that there are concerns that needed to be forwarded. But in the context where we need to clearly make sure that all of those are accommodated, it's a matter of timeline. It's a matter of making sure that they cohesively and coherently agree as to which ones would go forward and which ones will take a backseat for some time, Mr. Speaker, and members of this most of the assembly. That's the reason why, on matters of social order, we think that it's less likely for individuals to really antagonize each other by basis of differences or by basis of the whole idea of prioritization, because now everybody would feel that they have a particular timeline where their concerns will be highlighted, or whatever concerns they have, it's something that's going to be inevitably forwarded towards important avenues like advocacy groups, for example, or legislation. Secondly, we think that it's also helpful in as far as mobility is concerned. Because if you look at it, if a particular figurehead suddenly stops and eventually does not necessarily act upon certain things, we think the call for action and the achievement of goals is going to be less likely to happen, given that the dependency and the messiah complex that these figureheads enjoy is always going to be something that people will believe as something that's, of high importance. This limits the capability of of making people realize that the ultimate agency doesn't lie towards that particular individual, but within themselves. That's the reason why when we prefer these movements not having a figurehead, we also promote shared responsibility and accountability towards the movement in general. It is important because it attracts more members to look forward towards the goal and increase the measure of participation by making sure they're getting more involved and more identified with these movements. Why is this important? Because even in a case where there's diversity, we think that there is an overarching goal that they have to meet, but the strands as to which they're going to achieve change, for example, social justice or better legislation, is still catered and recognized. That means nobody's stopped and nobody's blocked or limited to essentially forward any particular action that they think is important for their members or for any other constituents to essentially experience and eventually achieve at the end of the day. The last thing I wanted to tell you is why is it important for social cohesion? Because if you look at it, the greatest credibility of social movements isn't necessarily the figurehead, but the cohesion and the coherent stance that individuals within that movement necessarily take at the end of the day. Why is that important? Because that's where credibility emanates from, Mr. Speaker. And that credibility is something that you cannot just pin down towards one particular individual just because other people believe that he's the only one who understands the concerns or he's the only one who understands the plight. We have to stop this culture of movements already recognizing that there's only one individual who would necessarily lead them to success. This is similar to movements like Hong Kong, for example, where they do not have a clear character that would necessarily provide or forward their concern. But at the end of the day, if it's a matter on matters of welfare, we think that they're safer because now, just because they're not identified or they're not necessarily identified as enemies, then it's less likely for the movement to essentially die down and not pursue its goals at the end of the day. What did you get coming from opening government's Prime Minister? I was able to tell you three things. That one, this preference has three important key things. It's important because it achieves social order. Second, it actually points into the whole idea of why it's important that we achieve mobility. But more than that, we have to make sure that we're able to establish credibility by highlighting that shared responsibility and accountability. With all these things, we're very, very proud to propose in opening government. Thanks.
When Martin Luther King rose to the podium and claimed for the civil rights movement a clear set of demands and a clear set of goals, we think that this is the strength of a social movement that personifies, that breaks the veil of ignorance by a relatable and a clearly charismatic character. Opening government operates on a false characterization of what these leaders are, saying that they exist only in the caricatured version of a cult of leadership and a cult of problem. This is not the correct burden for opposition to defend, because we can defend clear figureheads that are representative, that are just, and that change and evolve as movements go. What we will do on opening opposition is simple. We're going to clash on the idea that we prefer having clear leadership and clear figureheads because they bring three key things. Firstly, they necessarily represent leadership and control over the organization. That's to say, they represent an organizational structure. They are accountable to the people they demand, and they have control and influence over what the movement does. Secondly, they gain this position through a feature of internal and external legitimacy, meaning members ought to accept that leader, or else they can find new ones and empower different leaders, and crucially, this necessarily means that external agents recognize them as well, meaning the government, meaning certain political parties, especially given that their claim is they want change. Ultimately, the goal of these movements are to enact some form of legislative change to garner and protect its members and to ensure that its message are communicated clearly. The clear delineation is that government necessarily needs to defend movements without leaders, movements without clear protection. That means an example of this is the Arab Spring, which was seen as was a mob of unruly protesters who didn't have clear demands or clear protests. This looks exactly like the Hong Kong protest that had no clear stopping points and couldn't make compromises. And it looks like the Uyghurs. Movements have no leaders and no penetration at all. The order of my speech will be to analyze the growth of a movement, how it starts, how it gains traction, and how it sustains itself in the future. I'm going to weave in my comparisons at each level. Before that, let's talk about the two levels of rebuttal. He says cult leaderships are bad because they represent the worst of the people and they repress political views. One, we are against this as well. We think that members in different parties should be represented as best as they can. And that means changing that leadership when it is necessary. If it means that we have to silence some voices will always inevitably be silenced. The minorities of the minorities will always have less voice anyway. Unclear and assertive characterization. And secondly, I think it's easier to reform movements when you have a clear leader that represents what you want to achieve and what you want to do. More of that in my third argument. But first argument, how do movements start and why is it important for them to have a figurehead? Firstly, leaderships and figures are unnecessarily exist to solve a social problem. But to begin with, we need to understand that to have a problem does not matter if the society does not recognize it. Why do leaders change this type of mentality? Notice that the Uyghurs have a national congress in Germany. They have a universal rights campaign that exists in much of Western Europe. But the reason they are not seen as worthy of protection and why there's little international protest, even amidst the protests of Xinjiang, is because there is no clear figurehead for the Uyghurs, unlike the Dalai Lama, who speaks out for the same Tibetan protests. Arguably, we won't get change immediately, but the media attention is something that exists to begin with. Why? Because people need a rallying point and a clear picture to associate what movements are for, and the personification of narratives that are abstract, disparate, vague, or inconsequential. Not everyone knows everything about the world, and the marketability of your protest and your movement does require a clear version of an individual to create these claims. I think it's important for them to do this. Before I move on, yes,
Okay, so I think we should all learn that arguing by example is a bad way of arguing. The reason why we hate that we're not doing anything about the Uyghurs is because no one wants to go against fucking China.
we disagree. The reason people do want to call out and still exhibit some level of political opposition means that there is still a benefit to them having media attention and being recognized by the world, as opposed to the comparative on their side. They need to win both comparatives. Don't let them get away with a shady converse burden. Secondly, why do we think leaders have to have a correct narrative? Because it's easy to misrepresent the Chinese, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kong people who are called terrorists and protesters. The lack of a clear leader means these people are going to be chowed down by the fake news and propaganda run by these states. Agreed, these types of things will never be perfect, but it's clearer and people can have a stronger chance of clarifying and making those types of things and correcting those misrepresentations then. Second part of this argument, how do we necessarily enable the movements to get better and the process of compromise? Note that you can never win everything, and clear leaders necessarily have to set limits on what the negotiations are going to be. What does this mean? It means that leaders have to set clear goals in order to achieve the things that they want. First, like for example, like the waves of feminism that wanted clear legal and formal representation versus third wave feminism that had limited goals. The lack of a leader and the lack of someone who controls and funnels the party means you have a harder time creating clear goals that everyone should strive to. Secondly, this prevents them from making consequences. Using the Hong Kong example, Hong Kong already got what they wanted, the withdrawal of the extradition bill, but the lack of a clear leader and the mob protests meant that they had to go further and are now facing repercussions that further compromises would have changed. The same is true for every other form of leaderless movement that God has to defend. I think it's clearer when you command and manifest these types of changes on the first level. But on the second level, it marks external legitimacy, meaning people need to have a leader in order to converse with. States don't engage with a mob or a terrorist or a riot, and they therefore need someone who can promise them accountability for the party. This is why FARC and Afghan and peace talks in military movements and separatist movements require clear leaders to negotiate demands. The calculus of oppression means that without a clear leader, there is less incentive for them to listen to these people, to negotiate for change, and instead repress them. You increase the risk when these leaders are secret and unwilling to negotiate because you raise the cost of these claims. The second harm is you lose the moral ascendancy that you have as a party. Clear leaders mean that you do not have the trust and the ability to protect them. I think it's easier to say that you are the aggressors versus a state propaganda that says otherwise. Lastly, sustainability. Movements change and develop all the time. Constant renegotiation is a feature of leadership because that movement is defined by their ideals and collectivized core. They can demand accountability for a leader's actions in a way that they can't for thousands and millions of people they don't know and can never meet. They can never split off. And in the case of cohesion, we think it's perfectly fine if movements split up. So the civil rights movement was divided by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, violent and non-violent. Both are equal in terms of proving their claim. The harm of them splitting off, forming different ideologies, is fine because there is still an incentive to form coalitions and alliances against the state. And those types of things will exist regardless. But the leader is the only one who can reach this point and sustain that movement, without which desperation and the problem of the movement means you are unrecognized, unable to get change, and unable to sustain that change. Thanks.
I think it has to be made clear, Mr. Chair, that what government is standing for isn't just taking these leaders at their worst, but rather, even when these people are bearers of gravitas as great as the Dalai Lama or Ninoy Aquino or Martin Luther King, what we would want to claim in this afternoon's debate, Mr. Chair, is that everything, all the practical benefits and all the principled argumentation that could actually emanate from opposition hinges on the fact that order, when it comes to social movements, is something that is contingent on a hierarchical arrangement of these organizations at the end of the day. This also presupposes, this is also largely premised, Mr. Chair, on the assumption that certain people would have to be herded towards a certain direction for them to actually come to the right conclusions of exactly what they should do. But let's take their example, let's take their example of Martin Luther King. It wasn't necessarily just because that there had to be somebody who was specific, who had to verbalize the kind of struggles that these people actually experienced, but the kind of abuses that African Americans were experiencing for a long time are things that should have been strong enough. The kind of suffering should have been strong enough for them to actually make a move. But then, because of this constant ordering of our mindsets to the idea that we would need to have, that we would not actually make use of the monkey see, monkey do kind of mentality, that you would first have to actually see an example of success when it comes to the actual forwarding of your advocacy is something that we would actually consider as harmful. Because if this is the kind of mental calculus that people would use, they would tend to postpone until these things are much more convenient. Fine, we recognize that people might have that valid fear of backlash, might have a valid fear for their lives. But at the end of the day, going against this injustice is a good in and of itself. And your call to action isn't supposed to be contingent on a charismatic enough leader at the end of the day. That is why, as Deputy Prime Minister, I want to discuss exactly how our version of social movements actually calls for better individual ideation. And it actually becomes better for these individual members when it comes to their, not only when it comes to their equal ownership of their advocacies, but to the equal ownerships of the risks and responsibilities that they would have to bear. Because they ask us, who determines the priorities? And who actually has to be held to account at the end of the day? We say, Mr. Chair, that when it comes to the collective actions of these people, for as long as culpability, when it comes to abuses are concerned, these are things that could be adjudicated properly in the proper venues. If you injuries that are done by protesters who have simply gone too far, these are things that the culpability of these certain people should not necessarily be something that you hold the social movement's leader accountable for, right? So this in and of itself shows to you that these social movements actually are an amalgam of many individuals. And we believe that it is unrealistic for us to expect that there are certain select individuals who should actually be given more responsibility just because they somehow have this greater audience impact when it comes to the kind of approach that they would want to do. Because the biggest myth that they would actually, one of the biggest myths coming from opening opposition is this, that somehow when these leaders are absent, then it would be impossible for these social movements to actually exist in an orderly fashion at the end of the day. What we would say to this, Mr. Chair, is that instead of it something being emanating from the top, we would rather it be renegotiated from the ground up at the end of the day, because we believe that's the more natural way things exist in the very first place. Yes?
Why is having a leader no more a grassroots movement in your side of the debate than fighting for this social change? It's not clear that that's a dichotomy, and you're
The thing is, regardless of whether you place the context, whether it be the feminist movement, the LGBTQI movement, the idea that someone has to exist to bear that burden of being the person that people look up to as something that is irremovable and intrinsic to the success of a social movement, that is the value that you should be defending. This isn't about whether it is elitist or whether it is something that only exists in the grassroots. At the end of the day, we believe that when there is a more realistic view of ownership of risk, Mr. Chair, it is not simple. It is not going to be easier for people to simply shy away from their burden, to take hold of, to take action immediately and as urgently and as soon as possible at the end of the day. And they say that, it's important for us to gain external validation. Come on, do you necessarily think that the metric that we should actually judge the validity of the causes that are being fought for by the Hong Kong protesters should be the validation coming from big fucking monolithic institutions like the Chinese government? Like, are they supposed to say, yeah, you're actually doing good and this is actually a good thing, so yeah, your movement is actually valid because yeah, we support it? That's not how things work in the real world, Mr. Chair. The advocacies, the struggles of people like the victims and survivors of the Marawi siege isn't something that should be validated by Luzon or Visayas for it to be valid. The kind of struggles and the kind of process, the mothers and the parentless children that have been left devastated by the war isn't something that requires having a poster child, having a person whom we actually give all that kind of credit for at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, Mr. Chair, we believe that as far as social movements go, yeah, the kind of example that they provided, the kind of dichotomy between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King actually defeats their side at the end of the day, Madam Chair, because, Mr. Chair, the fact that these social movements could actually evolve, the fact that people could actually take different approaches when it comes to these certain things is generally something that suggests to you that this renegotiation doesn't necessarily have to doesn't necessarily to be spurred from the kind of consistency that a leader would have in maintaining a kind of view. Because inevitably, if at any point the current circumstances no longer apply, since they already conceded to the fact that these things should be open to renegotiation, it always goes back to the idea of whether or not, if we do not have distinguishable leaders, will we not be capable of having a reasonable expectation when it comes to social movements? And we believe that your opening government has succeeded in explaining to you that, yes, we could actually build things from, we could actually start from the bottom to the higher classes, to the higher levels, and reject that leveling arrangement to begin with. We propose.
In a perfect world, a social movement can suddenly read each other's minds
Everyone can hide behind and suddenly agree that this is how we're gonna fight for justice. We will either choose to all be non-violent or all be violent, and all our goals are completely the same. But we're not in a perfect world where that's how we fight for justice. Because we're human beings with varying interests and varying experiences of oppression. How then do we form a coherent narrative that allows us to best represent the common denominator of oppression? We say only through the existence of a clear leader are we going to be able to forward the interests of a multiplicity of people who have been oppressed at the end of the day. There are three main questions that were posed in the opening of the debate that we fundamentally answer in opening opposition. The first is, where do we get better reconciliation and representation of individual interests? The second is, where we best strengthen and sustain a social political movement. And lastly, why is it that external representation is so important and fundamental to a movement's survival? Let's deal with the first question, right? Because the first question that they tried to win on is that you're not unable to fully represent everyone's individual interests, because interests are fundamentally disjunct. They also try to burden push and say that, well, you can't say that movements will only exist because of a leader. Collective anger and collective oppression and the collective feeling that we are being harmed by something means that it's not our burden to defend that social movements won't exist without these leaders. We understand that people will feel collective oppression nonetheless, but we say that the ability to forward then and act on that felt anger, sadness, and oppression and violence against you can only be maximized and optimized if you have a figurehead who is elected and legitimized by the people, whether through formal forms of elections and legitimacy, or a legitimacy that manifests in you empowering that leader, cheering them on, and allowing them to represent your movement's banner statements on the media at the end of the day. Because they say, by virtue of you not being able to represent everyone, that is bad. But we pose the question, is everyone to represent, are all ideas and ideals and goals made equal? We say no, and not necessarily. Not even in their ideal world of everyone is individually empowered and everyone has ownership of the movement do they even get that proper, equal, equitable negotiation. Because within movements there are minorities. There are people who dissent and disagree with the goals of the majority. If a movement wants to be predominantly non-violent, we see that a small violent faction that feels that equal sense of entitlement and ownership over that movement, which is what opening government wants to defend, is likely then to get the media attention and misrepresentation fundamentally by them saying that they have the mandate to claim that they're the ones who best represent the movement at the end of the day. Sit down. So we think therefore you get even less representation because it's based on who best hijacks the media attention and claims that they have the best mandate, versus a leader who can directly negotiate and be validated by a greater majority, meaning that if majority of individuals support the means and goals that is expressed and communicated by the leader, that means that we're able to get a better and clearer picture as to what these social movements want. What then is the harm that they claim? They say that somehow it's a win on their side that groups can splinter off and evolve, such as the civil rights movement. They say that you don't need leaders to renegotiate these things. But rather, we say that is merely an assertion. We think that the very nature of two leaders being able to clearly distinguish different ideologies and strategies while still fighting on the same banner as civil rights is what actually empowered two different movements to achieve their goals at the end of the day. We think conversely on their side, when you allow individuals to feel the equal sense of entitlement to the claim to the movement, this is where you see worse infighting and the essential destruction of a social movement internally, because everyone feels that their individual goals and preferences are more important than others, versus one that is more democratized in nature, one that is more representative by nature of a leader representing a majority view. While we think splintering off can essentially happen, we also analyzed why coalitions in terms of fighting for the common denominator despite your different needs is also likely for you to be able to reconcile varying goals. The second question then of the debate is where we better strengthen movements and sustain them at the end of the day. Because their weird harm is that, things are just gonna always be postponed. We're always gonna wait for the leader because somehow a social movement leader just sits on his ass and stares blankly on the wall while everyone's just come on, we're waiting for you to do something. No, we don't think that's how leaders operate. We think that if you're a lazy and inert person, we don't think you're gonna get the validation of the people. Whereas no analysis of why the characterization is likely then to be true. We think more likely the inability or slowness of negotiations is a manifestation of internal negotiations as to what your goal and the means for you achieving social justice is. Therefore, we don't think that expediency or the immediacy of your action is a value, because if you immediately act act violently and it's taken like wrong and it's something that causes your movement to step back, we don't think the immediacy of that is a value at the end of the day. So we think that we better then strengthen a movement if you allow for that internal renegotiation rather than allow individuals to have conflict at the end of the day. And moreover, they claim that the call to action is something that is then exclusive on their side because somehow people are not going to be angry on our side. We think that people will have an even clearer call to action. There's no analysis as to why suddenly the political will and anger at oppressors will suddenly dissipate by virtue of their being a leader. Why will people suddenly abandon their life experiences and felt experience of oppression just because of this leader? No analysis there. We think that the interactions of individuals, insofar as they empower the leader to negotiate, don't necessarily mean that they have less of a stake, but rather they channel the political power necessary to forward their interests through a person who is most likely to succeed in negotiating with external things. Before I move on, yes.
In a world where movements have evolved into heavily complex intersections, how do you guarantee that the mere fact that a person is distinguishable makes that person fair in arbitration?
And this is exactly why we need leaders to be that are clearly distinguishable, because otherwise the distinguishability of who the figurehead is up to the misrepresentation of a media that is propaganda against you, which is the third issue. They say that external validation is not important at all. Well, woo! Why don't we just all gather Hong Kong protesters in one single room and allow them to yell at each other without yelling at their protesters? We think that the fundamental goal of any social movement is to convince and bring down and negotiate with your oppressors. You're not just there to yell about how sad your life is, you're there to negotiate and force people to listen. We think that then oppressors are more likely to do things like frame your leaders as the dissidents and the violent individuals so they can demonize you at 6 past 6 and demonize you and call you terrorists. And this is where you see you have less of a power to shape your identity. When people are actively mudslinging and saying that you're represented by the violent aspects of your movement, you're represented by these false prophets, and at the end of the day, we think it's better when you have an internally controlled, essential figurehead that is manifest of the individual people's willpower, and that only happens when you allow them to be distinguished and you allow them to actively lead forward the movement instead of leaving it all up in the air for those who want to bring us down.
So far, this debate has lapped heavily on comparatives, and I think that's opening government's fault. Realize that in the absence of a clear, distinct leader, you don't get a random mess of mobs that opening opposition claims to exist, but you get the shared stories and experiences of individuals being the central theme that people talk about. What does this look like? This looks like the Me Too movement, that being sexually harassed is the key theme that bonds people together. This looks like the Black Lives Matter movement, where the key theme are the police brutality against black individuals that people face across America. I think in the absence of clear figureheads, you have the clear presence of stories, but not just a single story, not just a single experience, but a diverse set of experiences that propel people to move forward. This is the diversity that you get from closing government, not from opening government. First thing I want to respond to opening opposition. Realize that opposition does not defend having clearly distinguishable figureheads. They only defend having a leadership structure that negotiates the way by which movements move forward. I think these are two exclusive things from each other. A figurehead is someone you see. A figurehead is someone who talks in front of the camera. But I think there are times in most movements that when we have lobby groups and policy crafters that operate behind the scenes and not necessarily in front of a camera. I think this is where you are still able to forward necessary policies, that you are still able to forward the goals that opening opposition wanted in this debate. I think these are two mutually exclusive things. So in the lack of arguing for a clear figurehead, they clearly do not fulfill the burdens of this debate. The second thing that I want to talk about is about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. The reason why they were successful in their time was not because they were good people, but because there was no internet. And the presence of the internet and fake news in the modern world makes it fundamentally more susceptible to mudslinging that BLO was so afraid will happen in government model. So we will argue that first. Realize that the extreme vulnerability of the movement makes us like vulnerable and likely to face character assassinations. So this is my first extension. I think this is important fundamentally. The first thing that you want is people are dumb. And because people are dumb, this means observers are likely to conflate and will conflate the figurehead for the movement. That means that regardless of your diverse set of stories and experiences, the fixation on a single figurehead means that people think that the figurehead is everything the movement represents. The conception from opening debate was that people are not perfect and they cannot represent everything. And that is true. The fact that you cannot represent everything means one, you are unsuccessful as a figurehead, but two, the fact that you are susceptible to being mudslinging in the world where anyone can Google you and find shit and dirt about you. Why is this important? If we think that the representation of the LGBT in the Philippines is vice ganda and like she gets demonized for, being vice ganda and doing vice ganda things, people's conception of what LGBT people are in the Philippines is vice ganda. So regardless of how they interact with other gay individuals, they will always think that that is who they are. But that is much worse when a scandal, like they are a sex offender, like Papat, the former head of LGBT or former face of the LGBT, a sex offender. That leads to fundamental harms that individuals will now perceive the movement to be full of sex offenders. 3 structural reasons why the people will think this. 1, people have cognitive bias. That means when they hear an initial point of inference, this influence will filter out everything else they learn moving forward. Second, people have short attention spans. So even if Papat or Vice Ganda become great people in the future, people only remember the initial shocking revelation of the scandal that was first put out. But lastly, I think people are easily misinformed and underinformed that the easily believable conceptions of individuals or the worst case scenario, because people like looking at negative things over the pretty things that exist in the world, means it is likely to be difficult to correct these types of conceptions about the movement. This is important in 3 reasons. 1, I think the movement now sheds away media attention towards cleaning up the mess of this individual. Why is this important? Because even if in opening opposition's best case that these leaders have demands and have goals, the demands and goals do not become the attention of the media, but rather the scandal becomes the media attention. And that is important because instead of talking about policies and ideologies, we are talking about a person and the assassination of that person's character. This has impacts to moderates because the awareness of moderates are no longer about the movement's policies, but rather the leader that shot the bed. And I think these are important in gaining awareness of the type of people we're fighting for and the buy-in for that. But I think this has an impact on politicians. Realize that when somebody shits the bed, politicians try to wipe their hands clean of that mess. I was not a part of this. I do not associate with these types of things. And that is bad for a movement when the leader becomes the core center of an issue rather than the policies that we want to talk about. But yes.
Given that the majority will want to misrepresent the image of the movement anyway, where is it easier to protect or disassociate from a splintered group or an individual leader?
Here. So that's the second part of my speech. Why I think so the conclusion to the first part is the figurehead makes us vulnerable as a movement. We'd rather not have one. What is the alternative? Realize in the Me Too movement, there have been false claims against sexual harassers. They turned out not to be sexual harassers. The women were penalized and were named and shamed. but we don't remember their names more than we remember the people who got taken down in the process, like Harvey Weinstein or like House of Cards guy. Why is this important? The turnover by which new stories come up, because there's no monopoly on a single story, ensures that we are able to replace bad shit with new shit right away. The new attention that people will now focus are on the success stories when we are able to take down a violent sex offender. It is only through a diverse set of alternative stories, like the Black Lives Matter, that even though one person was holding drugs or holding guns, that we still have the clear visual image of the other abuses that these people face, or of all the success stories that these people eventually succeed in being able to achieve. This is important because the replaceability based on diversity of stories we can select from is easier to replace than a figurehead that has so many barriers to achieve. You need to get internal validation, you need to get external validation, and all the other processes Leader of Opposition talked about. But a story resides in every member's experience. An experience is something shared across everyone. You can talk to the media, you can write about it on the internet, you can tweet about it. No, we do not need mind-reading capabilities, we just need Twitter. And I think that world is preferable because we are able to replace bad stories with good stories. We are able to share in that diverse media attention span rather than the shittiness of a clear figurehead. We're proud of this.
For socio-political movements to forward the type of change that they want, they have to A, ensure that donors and sponsors have a clear figure to donate to and hold accountable for these types of donations that should help these particular movements. But more importantly, they should be able to have a clear figurehead that is able to frame this particular group of individuals to be a political market that congressmen and legislators have to ponder to for them to get a vote. We think these tangible benefits are exclusive to closing opposition, and we're going to argue why this is the most important discussion that we have in this debate. So ultimately, I'm going to discuss how ultimately the best form of political representation is having a figurehead, and I'm going to argue in second level the best case and worst case of the movement. What if it fails? What if it succeeds? Why is closing opposition going to be better in both situations? Before I proceed, a few responses against entire government side. My first response to them is this discussion coming from opening government that, you know what, we want a bottom-up approach to how we create policies, and we have to respect diversity, the intersectionality of interest. We think all of these values so far are non-mutually exclusive because it does not prove, Mr. Speaker, that a leader in our movement is never going to change. Secondly, if they're going to argue, coming from opening government, that dependency of leaders is going to exist, like you have a leader who takes so much time deciding, or who has bad policies, or who is, disjunct to the feelings of the people, we concede. These are bad leaders as well, so the solution is to replace them. Meaning, this is a value-neutral discussion coming from Prime Minister because these are problems on the effectivity of a leader, not the existence of a good leader. Third response, when they tell us, coming from opening government, the greatest harm is that you're not equally representing them. Number one, when they argue that equal ownership of the movement is important, we concede to some extent that maybe equal ownership is important. But it does not mean that just because a leader exists, automatically the ownership is lost. Secondly, opening opposition already told you that the solution is to find a better leader. What we're going to do in closing opposition is engage in the worst case. It's okay for us if you're not able to represent everyone. Because currently, when you're talking about political movements, it's very, very volatile. Meaning, you have to choose one battle first, and subsequently, if you're able to win this, you're able to use this particular landmark, this landmark thing, this precedence for future causes. So ultimately, I'm going to clash directly with Papa, because he tells you that diversity of narratives is important. value because leaders are not burdened to represent everyone in the movement. They're expected to represent the average member of each and every movement. That's why when you analyze the Hong Kong movement, we don't care if these Hong Kong individuals who have the money and can go out of Hong Kong before 2047, we don't care about their concerns because they can protect themselves. What we're entitled as a leader is to prioritize the most vulnerable actors, the average individuals in our movement, not these particular privileged individuals. We can just leave them there because they can, migrate to the EU and, live a better life. Ultimately, my last response to entire government side is that what they fail to analyze is how this diversity of stories or how the lack of a leader will lead to social order and social change. Up until now, there's no logical mechanism how these stories will lead to the type of laws that you have. That is why, let's discuss first extension. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, what really is the origin of socio-political movements? Their origin lies in the lack of political representation. That is why figureheads are important and in fact are the best forms of political representation because it's a crowning, Mr. Speaker, of the communal interests of the majority to a representative. What does this mean? It does not mean that you're only able to set agenda as what was argued by Hans Wong. What it means, number one, is that you're able to pull valuable donations, Mr. Speaker, because there's a clear accountable party for these particular economic gains. Why is this important? We think these types of donations, for example, are important because they are enablers of your political change. You have to have some level of economic backup so that you're able to mobilize as a movement. And it's less likely that a person, a sponsor, a donor is going to donate to a movement that does not have a clear figurehead that they can hold accountable for this type of donation. In fact, most importantly, it's most important that we have these particular individuals because they are able to frame the movement as a political market. Meaning, Mr. Speaker, you have to influence this particular body, this particular figurehead, for them to vote for your rights. So ultimately, it's most likely going to lead for individuals to listen to you better because they're perceiving you as a group of individuals that have a vote in democracy and has the power to change these particular policies. We think, Mr. Speaker, comparatively, it's better for you to have a leader because A, it's more difficult to pull donations when you don't have a leader, but secondly, it's most difficult for you to frame yourself as a political market, Mr. Speaker, that is unified under sets of priorities without these particular leaders. Later na, before 6. Ultimately, okay, Papa.
So I said that NGOs and lobby groups can exist and can receive your donations. It again does not mean you have to be a figurehead or the face of a movement.
Okay, it's very difficult because if you have inconsistent agenda, for example, you're not going to use these particular resources best. That's why you have to have political leaders that are able to set priorities because the type of funding that you have can be used for the most important need that they need. So ultimately, okay, you have NGOs, but these NGOs will work on different priorities. They won't get the type of political representation that you want. Ultimately, let's implicate this then on the best case and worst case. On the best case, that we win this without a leader is difficult because it's going to lead to a political vacuum, Mr. Speaker, because there's no clear person to take the lead when you won this particular political rights, for example. That's what happened when the boycotts and coups happened in Egypt. When the revolutions in African regions happened, there's no clear-cut leader. That's why boycotts and that's why political vacuums are more likely to exist. In our worst case, how do you then recuperate? If you did not win the political rights that you have, it's more likely that you can recuperate better if there's a figurehead, Mr. Speaker, who can decide what's the next logical step for us to do or adjust our political strategy ultimately. So in the worst case, Mr. Speaker, we think a leader is most important. These particular leaders are important because without a leader, when this particular movement fails, the entire movement gets to be blamed and the entire cause gets to be invalidated. When you compare them to a leader, it's easier for you to disassociate now because you can point out that this leader is a bad leader. We don't like this. When Papa told us that, ultimately they will just remember the bad people, this is very speculative that all leaders are very, very bad. But secondly, we think the average reasonable bystander is less likely to invalidate the cause of the movement if the movement has the ability to isolate bad leaders from it. We think on these very nuanced standards, closing opposition has to win. Thanks.
socio-political movements, Mr. Chair, is that it is an uphill battle. In many times, these individuals will lose. In many times, these people will be discriminated, and the movement will start. We will probably not be able to outlive any of these movements at all. So a lot of us will live and die not seeing the movement get the legislation that they want. That's why Papat's discussion of like how the interaction of people and how people feel about the existence of a distinct leader is more important, because these are the visceral benefits that individuals feel. The idea that they get recognized, the idea that they are heard, the idea that their concerns are legitimate, even though there are other people who have greater problems than them. We do not want a figurehead to be the standard of legitimacy of the plights of every individual that exists in the movement, because we think that everyone shares that concern and everyone should have that should be heard and be considered equal, especially in a world where there's already enough space for people to be heard. The problem with the entire case of opposition is they have an issue with leadership. This is different from being able to get a distinct leader that is supposedly the face of the movement. The question is, why does that person have to be the media's target? Why does that person have to be the person that Congress goes to whenever they have a concern? Why does that person have to be the individual that represents everyone, even under the concession that that person is incapable of representing literally everyone in these particular movements? So there are three issues. First is the issue of recognition and clarity. Second is in which paradigm are we better able to sustain the movement. And third, what is really the direct effect of having a distinct figurehead, and like why it's particularly better off that they don't exist. But first, let's respond to like the petty donation argument that came from a member of opposition, because he said that we need a figurehead for people to put money in. Like I don't understand why you need to put money in that person's face. Like you could donate on a bank, you could donate to an NGO. As a matter of fact, we think that there's more trust if the donation is made to an institution where there are multiple members and there's accountability and there's a system for you to guarantee, rather than just putting it in the pocket of one person. We think that there's more likely for donations to exist in that level. So let's go to recognition. Sit down. First is the whole idea about how a face is required to be so that you can be deemed worthy of protection. This runs under the assumption that the most important recognition in movements has to come from the state, which naturally has a tendency to ignore you, because if the state is already recognizing you, then the movement wouldn't be necessary in the first place. So I don't understand why we even want to base the quality of the movement on the recognition of the people who are discriminating you in the first place. But even in the best case, we think that based on the characterization that these leaders do tend to be like monolithic and will prioritize certain things, the best case is that you only recognize one particular concern and leave out all the other people, which means that the state will no longer have an impetus to look at the other things, because obviously you've already done your job. You've already solved the majority. There's no discussion of the minority anymore. We think that the more significant source of recognition comes from the people themselves. The idea that all threads of Twitter talking about how they were sexually harassed are recognized and go viral, or the people are able to feel that they're not alone. The idea that they themselves know that there are other people who are experiencing what they're experiencing, and that is something that makes them feel good. Like even if we don't ever see the end of the movement succeed, the fact that these people feel safer, the fact that these people are comforted by the fact that they are considered to be legitimate, and that's something that we need to be able to consider, because like we don't want people to say that your concern is not as legitimate because some figurehead has experienced worse things than you have, and that's something that's completely ignoring the concerns of people. We think that this recognition is a value in itself, the auxiliary benefit of being able to sustain oneself even when the movement has not won. They told us that it is harder for us to be able to hijack. Because there's a person that essentially regulates the discussion in the movement. Now, the problem with this is they assume that the minority members are evil or like probably annoying people that you should ignore. And this is where the question is, why shouldn't you even be listening to them in the first place? Why should you be ignored just because they don't have similar majority experiences or similar experiences with the majority? We think that it is the person himself that is hijacking all of the things, because he is prone to biases, he is prone to certain inclinations, whether he's doing it advertently or not. We would rather have people vent at each other and be heard as equals and not be shut out and be considered as enemies who could possibly turn on you in the future. There's enough space on Twitter for people to be recognized of their concerns. We don't want the concern to be focused on a single Twitter account with the face of a particular individual, because there are so many other people out there that need that recognition. Yes.
In the absence of a clear leader, in a cacophony of everyone having a megaphone on Twitter, what is your comparative benefit? Because you've never really discussed how effective you will be at getting success stories when there's always a majority stereotyping effect that you yourself discuss.
Hello, the success stories and the stories being told by people are already existing. They're already going around in Twitter. What we need to do is that we don't risk the delegitimization of these concerns just because there's a figurehead that has higher standards than you. That's why we think that everyone should be responsible in hearing out the concerns of these particular people. Next is the concern of sustainability. They talk about splitting off and how a member of opposition claimed that it's not the job of the leader to be able to hear everyone's concerns. This is very concerning because it's not really just about them not recognizing. It's the fact that they themselves inadvertently cause a lot of concerns on the ground to be ignored because they themselves only look at the average, which is something that we don't want to happen in the first place because everyone's concerns need to be heard. Lastly, Papa's discussion of how it's important for you to avoid having a face in the movement because these are the people who become the legitimate targets of Congress, the legitimate targets of the media for campaign smearing and all other kinds of character assassination, which by the way was not responded to by a member of opposition. Because we think that what happens with the movement is that the movement will live and die with that particular person, but then a member of government, a member of opposition says, well, it's easy to replace them and disassociate themselves. That's a problem because the leader of opposition himself already said that it's not very easy to become a figurehead of a particular movement. You have to carry out, you can't just become the face and replace the movement as a whole. So you can't just say that, oh, it's so easy for you to replace that particular person and disassociate with themselves. We think that it is, what happens here is that it's much harder for you to kill the movement if you have so many stories that come out from real individuals, because the point of the movement has always been to make the issue look real. If you create a situation where, oh, there's only one person who tells a story, that individual can be dismissed as an isolated case. You have to make sure that the movement will live on, will exist in every single person's story, so that each of those stories are heard and shared on the internet everywhere, and not just in the face of an individual. When the spirit of the movement lives not just in one person, but in all of us, it lives forever.
I will talk about two things in my speech. Firstly is the goal of this debate. We think that it's fairly simple, that the goal of this debate is recognition and having tangible legislation to your social-political movements. I'm going to prove why it's better to closing opposition, and secondly, on the worst case that your social-political movement will fail, why it's better when you have a leader to disassociate from, and why is it better when you're a leader to demonize as opposed to demonizing the entire community as a whole. But firstly, on tangible benefit, the idea of legislation. Obeying opposition was clear in this debate. They want figurehead to represent the majority, the minority, and it's a representation to this movement. But we feel like it's better explained under closing opposition because we gave you tangible benefit. The idea that congressmen will listen to you, for example, because when you have a figurehead, you can easily rally the majority of the population of minority, and you become a political market. It means that you have a bargaining chip in terms of facing congressmen, for example. You can say that when you try to forward progressive laws, then we have 40,000 or maybe 100,000 of minority backing you and will vote for you for the next election. So in that case, you're more likely to get practical benefits coming from closing opposition because you are a market that this congressman, for example, or this legislator would necessarily want to have. Under government side, it's harder to rally, or it's harder to have a bargaining chip against these congressmen, for example, or these leaders who make laws because you are fragmented. What does this mean? That means that if you don't have a leader who can rally support from your minority, it means that you are fragmented in terms of forwarding the needs that you want from the congressman. It means that these are fragmented groups that will go to your congressman in different times, in different places, in different settings. It means that it's so weak because if the numbers are so little, then what is the incentive to listen? That is the question that I want to ask
government side. So, on the comparative, we're better off under closing opposition because Rick explained how having a bargaining chip, the idea of being a political market, is extremely important. How does this manifest in status quo? If you take a look at the United States election, electoral college are decided based on geographic advantages when it comes to voting. That's the same reason why Martin Luther King was able to rally and get rights, because he represents a specific geography and demography that can necessarily influence a very large, can have a very large influence towards election. If you don't have that leader who will necessarily represent that stream-specific geography and demography, then there's no reason for your leaders, for example, to listen to you individually because you are not a market that they can consider because there's no leader to necessarily talk to. So what is the implication to that? The government side, there's no analysis as to how when you have fragmented groups, you can necessarily lobby for support coming from congressmen, for example, or lawmakers, and why it's still effective. Even if you take a look at their best case where they can individually express themselves, or they have mobility and autonomy, where will that take you? That is the question to opening government and closing government. Because if that is the case, then let's just voice out all our concerns to the legislators, but how will they hear us if these are individual voices and you can't create a noise in Congress or in the majority of the population? In status quo, your support is already weak. When you are fragmented, it becomes weaker because the number dwindles and your support dwindles. We feel like on comparative, we're more likely to get tangible legislation, for example, in support for your minority socio-political group. Yes?
Politicians are campaigning against police brutality not because there is a clear figurehead against police brutality. It's just because the black people are a voter demographic. So nothing is exclusive to your figurehead.
The thing is, this police brutality is even highlighted when you kill that black person, for example, that became a figurehead for the black movement that was able to rally people from the African American community. We feel like even if you have, I'm going to my second issue, the idea of your worst case if you fail. Because they said that we need to have shared stories and narrative. This is the case coming from Papa. Rick pointed out, right, that this never translated to tangible benefits in its status quo. Where did it stop? In becoming a Twitter trend and a Facebook trend. There's no logical extent on it having practical benefits to your people on the ground. In fact, it's not even mutually exclusive because the fact that in status quo it exists, that Lee said that it exists, means that it can also exist and coexist with an existing leader to your figurehead to your minority movement. But furthermore, it even is it can also be attacked by your media, which is you're so afraid of, because these shared stories and narratives are even demonized and are even demonized and hijacked by your conservative media companies like Fox Company or Tommy Lahren, for example, saying that not all women are true are honest, and in fact a lot of them just want attention. In fact, your shared stories and your shared narrative are also can possibly be hijacked by the same people that you're so afraid of, but furthermore, it's not mutually exclusive. The exclusive benefit is when you have a figurehead, when you have a leader, for example, it's easy to disassociate from that leader as opposed to a story that will represent each and every woman. If a certain woman will come up, for example, and say that I was sexually harassed, and the people will only rely on a message in Twitter, for example, or Facebook, they're just gonna say that maybe you were not harassed at all, maybe you wanted that. But the fact that you have a figurehead, for example, who can say and who can rally for a singular message that these women are honest, that these women would not have come up if they were not harassed to begin with, is a benefit that represented to you. The idea that these leaders can necessarily represent these people, and the fact that this singular voice, no, it's already 6, Arvin, that this singular voice will cause a dramatic change in terms of support to your minority groups. But furthermore, their idea that they will focus on character attack to the figurehead. Notice that they picked possibly the worst examples in status quo, like Vice Ganda or Papat the sex offender. In fact, you can also have good examples like Greta Thunberg, for example, or a leader from Moro Islamic community who lived and experienced the horrors of being oppressed in Mindanao, for example. But the worst case is when you fail, it's better to have a figurehead because Rick said that it's easy to disassociate because it's a character mistake. It's not a mistake of the movement as a whole. So it's easy to replace that leader or maybe abandon the message of that leader. As opposed to when you rely a story, it's a story as Papa characterized that will live and flourish in the minds and hearts of individuals. It's so hard to counter that because these are stories that people have already read on Twitter or Facebook. As opposed to having a leader, a singular voice who can counter this misconception, we're better off when you have a figurehead. Thanks.
Talaga.